Let's name some stuff. Now, I can tell you from experience that naming new humans is a really big responsibility, but that also can be fun. And geeks, of course, like all of us, we love to name other things in our lives beyond just kids and pets, all things around the house, our cars, you name it, we love to make it unique. So what should you think about when you're picking a name? How do you want to customize your world and make it unique? Should you choose a name that's immediately recognizable from a specific character, or something that I call like a stealth geek name? And I'll talk about what that means in a minute. And finally, even once you've found a name that you like, should you consider nicknames, diminutives, longer forms of names? Because there's lots of different versions that you can do of names that are out there. Now, naming kids or characters or really anything else, it should be fun, but it also does take some effort. Okay, hold on, sorry, just and meanings of that word in other language units, exactly, yes, and I'll talk about that in a moment as well. Oh, I don't like this view that Zoom is giving me. Sorry about that. Give me 1 second here. You know what? I'm just going to move that manually. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so where was I? Do you take a chance with a name that carries a lot of baggage from its ancient roots, things like Jason or Cassandra? Or do you stick with names that come from noble roots and are only ever applied to heroes? Well, we'll talk about all of that. So just as a brief introduction, I'm just admitting people as they join in the waiting room. I don't know why it keeps having people go into the waiting room if we're already on. Oh, well, Zoom is weird. So my name is Scott Rubin, but as we'll talk about, a name is just a name. So who am I? Like you, I am a huge, well, I'm assuming like you, I'm a huge geek. I have comprehensive knowledge of multiple fandoms. I've created, played, and written about characters in many different worlds. I'm a Twitch streamer. I appeared on Geek and Sundry back in its heyday, and I've been with Hyper RPG for almost 5 years. And I've been streaming by myself during the pandemic, right from this very seat, sharing all of my super niche geeky interests with the world. Oh, should be a setting at the bottom of your screen. Okay, cool. Is it in participants? I don't know. I don't use Zoom a lot, but that should be fine. Okay, that should be fine. Beyond all of that, I'm a toy collector and reviewer. What you see behind me is not a Zoom background. That is part of my toy room. That is my wall. And beyond that, I've studied ancient languages and etymologies. And I happen to be somewhat of an expert on the subject because I wrote a book on naming all things geeky, naming your little geek. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So what are we talking about naming today? Of course, we have the traditional things, right? We're naming kids. I've got 2 of those. We're naming pets, of course. And there are, beyond even that, pets and kids, there are lots of people who find new names for themselves to better reflect their inner truths as they go through life, which is awesome. But we geeks, we go way beyond that. We love to name everything. There's a bunch of stuff in your mundane stuff in your life that we can name just to make things more fun. People name their cars, their computers, their Wi-Fi networks. They're all just begging to be named. Nothing is safe from being anthropomorphized by nerds. Just look at things like plants, excellent, good one. Look at things like the Mars landers, right? Or satellites. People name them and imbue them with personalities, and we get sad when they stop working. I mean, these things are lifeless, but giving them names helps give them characters. And then, of course, for us geeks, there are even more specific things, right? We've got player characters in all of our RPGs. We've got NPCs for GMs who are always looking for that name on the fly. Oh, who's that character over there? It's Joe. That's right. That's Joe, the character. We've got OCs and original characters for artists and writers, models and miniatures for tabletop gamers, etc., etc. And I'm sure there are more things that you all could provide, like, as Patrick said, plants. That's a great one. So when you choose new names for people and things, you really want to know where those names come from and where they've appeared, be it movies, comics, novels, video games, and more. Okay, so names are really fun, but where do we start? And I got to tell you, it's not a very exciting answer, but it's really all about research. Now, don't get discouraged when you hear that. The internet, of course, is your friend, and there are tons of reference places, from the Wikipedia to all of the cool fandom wikis that are out there. There are baby name catalog websites and so much more. It's still the internet, though. So if you're looking for baby names and you really want to know information on stuff, and you come across a website that explains that a baby named Monica will have 3 guardian spirits and her lucky day will be Wednesday because of the shadow from Jupiter, maybe keep doing research. But anyway, all of that information is fine. There are lots of silly and sort of like mystical types of information out there. And if that's your bag, then that's great. Now, some other really good sources for names, again, whether you're naming kids or characters, are actual just characters themselves. So there are things like character guides. So I've got one here from DC Comics, Transformers. You may not want to name a kid after a Transformer, but it's possible. Other comic books have it. There's a long series of Marvel books that are like that. Role-playing game books have guides with more characters in them than others, and lots of names. Now, these can be great to know all of those characters that have come before, lest you stumble into pitfalls, and there definitely can be pitfalls. Unless you're really looking for it for a reason, be careful, because you might end up using the name of a goofy, evil, or pitiable character. Particularly if it's really famous for coming from that source, whether it was invented or became famous that way. Some obvious examples might be things like, for a lot of people, Bella isn't the most admired name after a certain vampire series. Other names like Grima, Hodor, Voldemort, Palpatine, like these are names you don't want to accidentally give those to a heroic character or a child and then not realize, oh, wait a minute, that name is not necessarily viewed the best by a lot of geeks out there. So when you're doing research, as I did a lot for my book, you may even find some interesting commonalities and comparisons across different characters with the same name. So for instance, when writing my book, I came across things like the name Gordon. Gordons are often across various properties, different characters with the same name. Gordons are often brilliant and talented, but they don't put all their gifts to use or have what others would consider like a mundane job when they're first introduced. Similarly, Wesleys, for some reason, lots of Wesleys usually have a normal life until something major jostles them out of their comfort zones and propels them into heroism. The name Max shows up all across different genres, and many new people, shows up across all different genres, and especially there are a lot of Maxes that the name shows up for pets a lot in geek properties. And then you may be familiar with some discussion in a famous / infamous movie about the name Martha, right? I assume most everybody here has seen Batman versus Superman, whether you liked it or not. And there's that very, very famous scene about the name Martha and what it means to the two main characters. And a lot of people give that scene, sort of give that movie crap for that scene and think it's kind of silly. You know, why did you say that name? That sort of thing. But as I found out, especially going back through comic books, the same names are repeated so many times. And if you look back in the histories of all these characters, both the Kents and the Waynes had ancestors named Nathaniel, so that could have popped up. And particularly the name Mary, there are so many comic book characters whose mother's names are Mary. It's wild. So we could have had that a very similar scene, just like the Batman Superman one in a Spider-Man movie, because Mary is the name of Spider-Man's mother and Doc Ock's mother. So that could have happened. Mary is also the name of the mother of the first Robin, the third Flash, the Invisible Woman, and the Human Torch. So there are a lot of names that pop up in multiple places for similar kind of things, again, and not just mothers, but all sorts of other things out there. Yeah, ZZ, that is an excellent point about Daenerys, and yes, names. So I talk about it in my book that when you name something after a character, you do always run the risk of what might happen to that character past when you give the name to something else. When we're talking about comic books, comic book characters, they're never just good or just bad. They'll always be written by a new person that comes along. So you never really know where that character is going to go. And even if you consider a character that the character is dead, he or she is gone for good in whatever property is, well, hold on, because in fiction, nobody's really dead forever. Anybody could come back and be rewritten by somebody else later. So talking about names that have come before and things, there's an interesting thing that happens with some names where you sort of play off of or change what the name means. And I talk about this with regards to some names that came from really basically problematic characters in their origin. So we see this a lot with names that come from ancient Greek mythology, or at least names that appeared in ancient Greek mythology, and names that have been sort of what's the word? Redeemed in modern times. So one of the best examples is the name Jason. I don't know are there any Jasons who are watching right now, but yeah, and it goes both ways. Absolutely. So ancient heroic names sometimes end up being used for names that are characters or organizations or things that are less good in modern times. But yeah, Jason is one that I talk about a lot. Jason is a hero in Greek mythology, but he is not a particularly successful and noble hero in most of the stories. But of course, there are lots of Jasons in more modern geeky stuff that are super cool. We've got Jason Bourne, we've got Jason Rush, who's Firestorm, Jason Todd Red Hood, an anti-hero, but a hero nonetheless. So that's one that has sort of been redeemed in modern times. Another really, really big one is Cassandra. Cassandra in Greek mythology, if you're not familiar with, she is one of the most pitiable characters of all times. She is blessed with having foreknowledge of the future, but she's cursed in that no one will ever believe her. And so she's stuck foretelling these horrific events and tries to warn people to get them so that they don't happen. And they always do. And then, in fact, she'll die in part of that as well. So again, we've got this name that's really, really sad. And yeah, well, yeah, Apollo had a big part to do with that, of course. But again, in modern times, in modern geeky fiction especially, we've got Judge Anderson in the Judge Dredd series, Batgirl Cassandra Cain, Cassie Sandsmark Wonder Girl. There are a whole bunch of Cassandras out there. Hermione is another name, depending on how you feel about the Harry Potter series. But again, Hermione was a character in Greek mythology who was not really the best character, but there is a heroic character with that name much more recently. Now, of course, depending on your preference, there'll be a limit as to how disturbing or pitiable the original character is and whether you want to reuse that name. Maybe consider not naming a couple of twins, Cersei and Jaime. Maybe stay away from something like that. Now, completely on the other hand, for pets and little cute animals in your life, I'd actually encourage using the names of less than savory characters if there's some sort of aspect that fits or catches your fancy. I love, love, love cats and dogs named after villains. I think that's like the best thing ever. So if you've got a fat, lazy dog, maybe Jabba would be a good name for it. Or an overbearing cat could be Maleficent. You can even go really crazy and find like names that were created specifically to be ridiculous for your pets. Things like from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Slarty Bartfast. Great name. Definitely should be used more by people today. Now, as I've already talked about, and I'm going to talk about more, do your research. Research is the way to find all sorts of great names that are already out there, names that you can adjust and make your own. And you can be like our good friend J.R.R. Tolkien and steal those names. I'm not sure if you all are familiar, but even this guy lifted a bunch of the names of his characters from Norse mythology and the Prose Edda in particular. Most of the dwarves in The Hobbit and other characters, the names are just literally just pulled right out of here. Names like Dwalin, Bifur, Bombur, Nori, Ori, Oin, and more. Then you might say, well, those are sort of like, you know, all of these dwarves in the background. Thorin, Gimli, and Gandalf are all names from the Prose Edda that Tolkien was like, yep, I'm just going to grab those and use those in my novels. Again, which is fine. And if he can do it, you certainly can as well. Yeah, negative examples of names, exactly. Katrina and Alexa, right. Names that become associated with different things, which again, like there's not really any way to wholly prevent that from happening or to somehow see the future and what a name might be. But yes, you never know. And that's actually, we'll come back to that when we talk about names that are nicknameable, because I have a whole section, whole set of thoughts about that. So even all of that is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to sources of finding names that are already out there. And there's certainly lots of other places to look. I'm a big fan of looking at ancient mythologies. And again, there are who's who books, character guides, things like that. But when you're, even with those kind of things, think outside the box and think outside of what you, your player group, and your family might be familiar with. Consider mythologies and stories from other cultures, games and genres you don't normally play or read, and the like. And also think about characters that are from sources in other languages. Things like Russian fairy tales have some really neat names in them that you might not be familiar with or have seen very often. Things like other, again, mythologies that you might not be as familiar with or from different parts of the world are great sources of names. And again, do your research to find out what these characters were. You know, just take a look at what's out there, because I'll tell you from experience and from my research and studies, there are so many names out there in the world. Go ahead and create your own, but there are a lot of great ones out there. Now, I don't think anyone's mentioned this, but when you're creating names, especially for characters in role-playing games, and even more so, especially for GMs who just need NPC names to crank those out, there are, of course, online random name generators. Now, these can be very useful, especially in a pinch, and they can be fun. But I always put a caveat on these, that they can be good and they can be bad. The best thing about them, of course, is that they can give you lots of options very quickly, right? But oftentimes they're also giving you a lot of junk. Sometimes they are just recycled names from, like I said, from mythologies and other properties, or just mashups of random syllables. And you never really know if the creators of the random name generator did their research into where these names come from. So again, you might get a name result that means something to some people that doesn't fit with your character concept, or that represents a character that you might not be familiar with that could, you know, cause you trouble later on. Now, That being said, of course, there are random name generators that are put out by more, let's say, reliable sources, and then just some random one that you find on the internet. But again, if you use something like that to pull up some names, just throw it into Google, see if the name comes up in some other place, just so you have it, so you have all the knowledge that you might need. Now, on the flip side of even that, if you're naming something like an orc or a troll, you might actually appreciate some name that's just jumbled up guttural sounds like Throck or Drolg or something. So those can be really fun as well. Now, this is a little bit of a side note, but no matter what or who you're naming, you know what, keep it a secret. Don't reveal the name until the actual reveal. And this goes for naming kids, naming characters that are going to appear in something. Because you know what? People have really annoying opinions on things. And inevitably, when you tell people, oh, you know, we're thinking of this name or this name's going to come up, they're going to give you some opinion that you're not going to like. Whether it's something like, oh, you're going to name your kid Rufus, like Rufus the Doofus. Okay, come on. Or for your upcoming you're thinking of a name for an evil NPC for an upcoming game, and they're like, well, Malacraw doesn't sound that scary. It sounds like a marshmallow. It's like, oh, well, that was my whole concept was around this character name. So just keep your name to yourself until you actually reveal it. Again, if you're having a kid, keep the name to yourself until the kid is born, or in a game. Rebecca says, best name advice I received from my GM, say it out loud a few times before you settle on it for sure. That is fantastic advice. Yes. Because a name will look a certain way on paper or in your head, but actually saying it can definitely sound or feel different. Rowena said, yes. Secret. Names, there's all sorts of traditions and then jokes about names being secret and the power they hold, but it's true. I mean, your names do hold power over characters, over people, and it's important to really feel out the name before you ascribe it to something. I mean, of course, if you don't mind it, and if you're making a character who is more on the lighter side, then that might be okay. But in general, hold it in. Wait till that moment of the full reveal. Something that I like to talk about, just as it's kind of silly, but in general, a universal idea for names. For a really cool name, even if you're saddled with the most mundane name you can think of, add an epithet to it. Epithets make all names instantly so much cooler. Is your name Bob? Well, how about Bob the Eternal Peacebringer? Carrie? Carrie the Master of Flame. There's a great scene about this in one of my favorite movies, Krull. And there's a wizard named Ergo who chastises a boy named Titch for having such a boring short name. And then he reveals his full title. And so he is Ergo the Magnificent, short in stature, tall in power, narrow of purpose, and wide of vision. And you know what? While you're at it, give yourself an epithet. You'll thank me for it later. Kerrigan is an awesome name. Yep. Yeah. And again, that brings me exactly into my next point here. Long forms, short forms, options for nicknames, and customization. Now, this is super, super fun stuff, or at least I think so, because I love names and talking about names. You may have your own feelings about this. And again, this applies to naming kids or any kind of characters you might be creating. So short names are fine. Look, I'm Scott. I get it. There's not a whole lot you can do with my name, especially because my parents early on were like, no one will ever call you Scotty. So I never had a nickname. That was it. There wasn't much that anybody could do with my name. But when possible, consider using longer forms for the true name of your character, your pet, your child even, and then you can have short forms or nicknames for everyday use. So both of my children, both of my sons have long names that are traditionally easily shortened and nicknameable. So we've got a Benjamin and we've got a Maximilian. So we've got, lots of options in there: Ben, Max, there are Bennies, there are Benjis, all different options for those. So think about that again when you're naming your characters, your children, your pets. Maybe think about using a longer form that you can shorten for everyday use. Down the line, especially a kid will have options as far as, okay, what do you want to be called? You have all these different versions. My favorite example in fiction of a long form name is from Dragonlance, a character who also goes by the title The Golden General. Do you like the name Laura? Well, consider a full name Lorana, or even the entire version Laura Lanthalassa. So this is, again, you can name somebody or something Laura Lanthalassa, but only ever call her Laura. And then, that could be just a cool longer form and options for, different situations. And similarly, you can use this in your storytelling too. So if you're in an RPG situation, and there's this evil lich that the characters have heard of, Boran Dizamar or something like that, and then they might not immediately make the connection with Rand, right? A small part of that larger name, who, seems like an innocent tavern owner, but is actually the undead lord in disguise. So you can oftentimes play with long forms and short forms in your games, or even in your writing. So in general, long, complicated fantasy sci-fi names are awesome and should be used more. And it definitely makes for interesting times when, like, say you do use something like that for a child on that first day of roll call. Yes, teacher, my parents named me Fistandantalus, but everyone just calls me Dan. So you can often come up with fun, short names for long, crazy names that are out there. Going sort of reverse as far as long names, there are different ways of shortening names as well and making, smaller. And truly the master of shortened forms of long names in fantasy was Anne McCaffrey in the Pern series, if you're familiar with that. So on the planet Pern, there's a tradition of male dragon riders, just the male ones. They get shortened names with apostrophes when they become imprinted on a dragon, and there's some sort of method for that. It's kind of random when you actually go through all the names. So yeah, Falarnon becomes Falar, Famanoran becomes Fanor, Phalessin becomes, well, Phalessin. So anyway, there's all sorts of ways of shortening, contracting names. And hey, use more names with apostrophes. That's also things that aren't used enough these days. Apostrophes in names are definitely fun. Now, I talked about here thinking of names that come from other sources and other cultures, languages, civilizations that you're not super familiar. Now, I do want to mention, and this is something that I talk about in my book, regardless of the characters that have had any names in the past, unless you are really specifically looking at the ancient roots of these languages, or you're working in a language that has different rules, names do not inherently or independently have genders, and names can be used by anyone. People get hung up on, oh, is that a boy name? Is that a girl name? That's all ridiculous. Throw all of that out the window. Name anything, name anyone, anything you want. Now, again, there are names that traditionally are applied to one gender or another, and that can vary across countries, societies, and even different eras. Choosing something that goes against the traditions can be really cool and really memorable. Again, for a pet, for a child, for a character. We can think of things like popular male characters named Ashley, which again, Ashley is a name that has been used for males across time, but it's more, nowadays we think of it more as a name for girls. A Boy Named Sue, things like that. Star Trek Discovery has Michael Burnham, the lead female character. So there are ways you can sort of play with names and use them in ways that are not traditional, but still, super cool. Now, circling back a little bit to naming children, when you're naming children as geeks, right, we think of names that have been used in geek properties before. We think of geeky names, and you have a choice between sort of obvious geek names or what I like to call stealth geek names. So what are some examples that we can think of? I'm sure just about everyone here can immediately identify where these names come from. Katniss, Anakin, Daenerys, as we noted before, and Legolas. So these are obvious geek names, right? And they're cool, but they will draw a very specific kind of attention and comparison. And again, if you're naming a child any of these things, anyone who meets that child would be like, oh, I know what your parents were thinking of when you were born. But at the same time, there are lots and lots of names that have been used for really great characters in geek sources that don't scream geek at first glance. So names like the ones that we gave our children. So Benjamin, well, you might not think, well, Benjamin, what kind of a geeky name is that? But if you know your characters, you'll know Captain Benjamin Sisko of Deep Space Nine, Marvel's The Thing, who is Benjamin Grimm, Ben Tennyson, and of course, the first time we meet Obi-Wan Kenobi, he is Ben Kenobi. Similarly with Max, Maxes and Maximilians are all over the place in geek properties. Everything from the Trimaxian drone ship Max in Flight of the Navigator, Mad Max, Miracle Max, Professor Arturo in Sliders, Uncle Ben of Spider-Man, exactly, yep. DC has the Zen Guru of Speed, Max Mercury. Magneto is sometimes Max, not always, but comic books are weird. Max Headroom, Max Sterling in Robotech. So there are so many of these character names that are out there. And again, when I was doing research for my book, I came across so many of these and got to write about all of these character names that appear in multiple places. There are a ton of Simons across comic books, TV shows, movies. William is, I think, the name I came across the most in my research. There are dozens and dozens of Williams throughout fantasy, sci-fi, horror, you name it, Williams show up all over the place. And again, oftentimes in lots of different ways. So when we were naming our children, we were looking at, we did some of this character research. I'm like, okay, well, what Maxes have been out there, what Benjamins have been out there. And for names that are very popular like these, you're going to find characters that are more and less noble, but as long as there are some good ones that you can show your kid. And I talk about that too. It's like, okay, well, look, yes, there are characters who have your name that are not so great, but look at this one. This one's really cool. Let's focus on that one. We're going to get you a toy of that one. You can put up artwork of it. Focus on that one. Now, you can also consider when you're giving out names to, again, either your children or names for characters in anything that you're working on, think about family units, right? When you're naming brothers, sisters, sons, daughters, twins, and that kind of thing. So I talked about earlier that, Cersei and Jaime might not be the best names for a set of male and female twins. A better set might be Luke and Leia, depending on your perspective and your point of view. But again, think about families in your favorite properties. The Fantastic Four, House Atreides in Dune. There are tons and tons and tons of these out there where, you've got character names that are connected to other characters. And, think about using those. And don't worry too much about how dysfunctional those families might be in the fictional settings. Real life families aren't perfect and they'll be dysfunctional anyway. And again, when you're dealing with stealth geek names versus more obvious geek names, The really wilder ones, maybe reserve those for pets rather than children, pets, or inanimate objects, like we've talked about. Naming things like cars, your computers are really fun. Names like Furiosa, Chakotay, Sephiroth, Zatanna. These are names that maybe not so much for children, but for other things. And also, again, you can pair that up with sort of fun combinations of character names in things. So like two members of a litter could be Bavmorda and Mad Mardigan, to have a fun pairing. So as you can tell, I love names. I love researching them, talking about them, giving them to characters, pets, anything else. We've got our cat is named Arwen from Lord of the Rings. Our Wi-Fi network here in the house is named after a very famous movie robot. I'm not going to reveal which one it is. You can take guesses. But the point of all of this is that naming things is fun. Research is your friend, definitely your friend, so you know where the name came from. Oh, Johnny Five is a good one. Not the name of ours, but that is a really good one. And yeah, I mean, essentially, for a lot of people, naming things in their lives can be a really stressful thing. Obviously, naming kids is sort of above and beyond, right? But even when in naming characters, a lot of people have all of this anxiety. Oh, what if I give it a silly name? What if the name isn't cool? How is it going to sound? But naming should be fun. So have fun with it. Do your research, come up with something, interesting on your own, or a name that's worked well in other things before, but have fun with your names. So a little brief talk about myself. So I did write this book, Naming Your Little Geek. So if you are looking for a name source, like I said, I've given you lots of them that are online that are certainly free and easy to use. So when my wife and I, when we were pregnant with our first child, we were thinking of names, and we were thinking of the name Benjamin. And my wife and I were both big geeks. Again, you could probably tell from me at least. And so we were thinking, okay, well, Benjamin is a cool name. We were looking for a name that started with B. And then we were like, well, okay, look, we want to know all the characters in all of geek properties that have been named Benjamin, right? We don't want there to be a name out there. We could think of a bunch of them on our own, but we didn't want to be surprised. Somebody come up to us at a convention sometime and say, oh, Benjamin, like Benjamin so-and-so from some book. And we're like, oh crap, we didn't know that one when we named him. So we were looking, and I couldn't find a source that really had that kind of information in it. So my wife said, well, you should write it. And I said, okay. And then many years later, this book came out. So what I did for this book is I went through and I pulled the names, the character names from, like I said, all of our favorite properties, or a lot of them at least, pulled out the names, cross-referenced them, made tons and tons of databases and spreadsheets. And then when in here, so I have almost 1,100 name entries, and I talk about where the name comes from or what it means, both in if it's a real life name or if it has a fictional origin, like if a name has if the name has a meaning in Sindarin, for example. I'll talk about that. And then I talk about all the different characters that have had those names. And what was really cool, again, was looking for those commonalities or similarities between characters. Logan is a really interesting one, right? Who's the most famous Logan? We've got Wolverine. And yes, technically his name is James, but most people know him as Logan. So we've got Logan as Wolverine. There's a Logan in Warhammer 40K, Logan Grimnar, and both of those characters are bestial. They live a really long time. They have heightened senses. And it's like, oh, that's really interesting. Does that have anything to do with like the origins of the name Logan? Not really. In that case, it was a coincidence, but it was an interesting coincidence. There were a couple of other Logans as well that had some interesting things that tied them together. So that kind of thing was really cool, was finding these names that, again, there's no reason why characters with these names in vastly different properties should have similarities, but in some cases they really did, which was cool to find and talk about. And then I referenced, of course, where all of these characters came from. So I referenced almost 4,400 characters in the book. I do a little thing at the end where I'll show you like names that have and what genres they've appeared in. So like if you're thinking of, I'm thinking about the name, let's see where's it going on here. Well, Yog-Sothoth, of course, only appears in horror settings, but you can find names that, are just fantasy names or names that show up in various sources. If you happen to be interested in this for a source for your names, Naming Your Little Geek is available wherever books are sold online. It's in some bookstores, but again, like I said, there are tons and tons of cool places to find names online. Johnny Sims, yep. Lots of Johnny and Sims out there. If you are interested, and please, if you have any questions or any name references that you think are particularly interesting, please go ahead and throw those in chat. Everybody can read them, or I'll talk about those and reference them. Or if there's any names that you have come up with for your children or characters that you think are pretty cool, we'd love to hear those as well. I'm trying to think back. It's actually been really interesting in going out and talking about my book to people and finding that there are indeed lots of geeks out there who have given very notable geek names from these properties to their children. I met a person who named a son Raistlin, which is, if you're not familiar with it, a character from Dragonlance. And I was like, well, that's super cool. Of course, there are some famous examples, right? Robin Williams named his daughter Zelda after the character from the video games. We've got Nicolas Cage named his son Kal-El, which is like kind of the most amazing thing ever. I mean, Nicolas Cage has done a lot of amazing things, but that is pretty amazing. What's the other one? Oh, famously, Kevin Smith named his daughter Harley Quinn Smith. So there are some famous people out there have done this. Whether you think that's cool or not, that's fine. You don't have to think it's cool, but it is interesting how these names reappear and show up in different places. Becky says, I named my dragon Triamore because she is a trial of love. That's awesome. Yeah, and again, like mixing up different languages, words that mean different things. Make your own names. Names are an Arthurian fairy. Yeah. That's great. I mean, again, names are super fun. There's lots of different things you can do with them. And even names that sound like one thing in one language, use it for something that is totally different. So a name that might sound, flowery, use that for a villain, right? Switch it up. Do fun things with your names. Maybe not with your kids' names, but definitely with your names for characters. So I know everybody has lots of cool things to do today for Gen Con Online and whatever else you're doing. So before we wrap it up, and again, I'll still be here for a little while and we can talk more about names. If you want to, if you're interested in talking to me anymore and want to follow me, you can find me at all social medias at Norse Meat. Norse like Vikings, meat like steak. Norse Meat. That's my my online handle. And I would ask you to please do the thing with the Gen Con tickets where like you click that you went to this seminar and whatever. And if there's an opportunity to let the con know that how much you loved my talk, let them know. And hopefully I can see all of you in person at Gen Con next year. Who knows? Who knows what the world will be like in 1 year from now. But yes, Eunice says, my mother's skill was finding names in English and Chinese that sounded similar and had similar meanings too. Yes, it's so cool. And again, talking before, you'll finding names that have appeared again in various cultures or different types of properties that have similarities. And it's always really interesting to find those. Yeah, and Becky says, I try to make the name hint at the character's personality, and very few people catch on. Yeah, so I talked before about like if you have a name in mind for a kid or a character, like not to reveal it until the big reveal. Uh, on the flip side of that, if you use a name for a reason, right, because the name sounds like something, or if it's a reference to something, you might want to, foreshadow the character with the name. But just as often, people will not get it and not understand what you're doing with the name. Names are funny. People don't expect, especially in the United States in modern times, people don't necessarily expect names to have a lot of meaning. They're just names. They assume like, oh, you just recycled a name from this, oh, is that a family name? Blah, blah, blah. And that's why sort of too, Americans have this, it's not necessarily a good habit, but a lot of Americans, when they hear a name from another culture and another language, they'll be like, oh, what does that name mean? And it's sort of like romanticizing and exoticizing names from other cultures, because sort of partly because American names are often so boring. It's like, oh, well, other names must be so much more interesting and cooler. Auduna for your abandoned werewolf. Yeah, Auduna means abandoned and lovely. Right. And yeah, there's so many fun things you can do with name meanings. And again, either on purpose and deliberate for what it actually means, or to reverse something and give it a twist, which again, oftentimes people will not get unless you beat them over the head with it. And like I said, going back to the Greek mythology stuff, that's a great way of doing something like that too, is taking a name that has a very specific meaning for an ancient character or where the name comes from, and then turning that on its head, using a name for ancient villains, for heroes, or vice versa. Some are, now again, there are lots of names that are so obvious and so iconic that it's tough to reuse them. A name like Achilles, you're not going to easily be able to drop that into a game and not have that be a moment of taking people out of the game, unless of course your game happens to take place in ancient Greece or a culture or society that is heavily based on that uses those kinds of names. But even something like that, so slight digression, but if you are familiar with names from ancient mythologies and you find them interesting, still do some research, because in a lot of cases, a lot of times the way we pronounce names is not necessarily how ancient people did. And Achilles is actually a great example of that. If you were to go back in time and find someone from ancient Greece and you said, oh, and you were going to talk about Achilles, the person would look at you and not have any idea what you're talking about, because in ancient times, his name was Achilles, not Achilles. And so, you can see that in something like Hercules, which was the Latin base for Heracles. And so again, you can look at names that are from ancient sources that are sort of commonly known these days, but there might be alternate ways of spelling or pronouncing them. Speaking of pronunciation, pantheon.org. Yeah, there's a lot of cool places online to look at names. Perseus is a database of ancient texts at Tufts University. So I think it's perseus.tufts.edu. But so again, like you can read almost any ancient works there in the original language and in translation, but they also have links and dictionaries and databases there for all sorts of cool stuff. So yeah, there's lots and lots of information online for all of these things. And again, it sounds boring, but I hope through all of this and what I've described, you can find the fun in it. But just do some research. Research can be very rewarding when it comes to names. Again, finding names that have been used for one thing that might be cool for something else. Rare names that don't appear very often. Names that were invented for one thing and then never used again. Again, like Slarty Bartfast is a good example. That name has, unless somebody has picked it up and used that to name their pet, That name has never been used outside of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So there are some really iconic, weird names out there that you can either use or take inspiration from, change some letters around, and reuse it. Or take two names, smash them together. Yeah, I mean, Slarty Bartfast isn't the it's a mouthful, to be sure. And it was specifically invented to be a crazy name that would sort of catch people's eyes and be like, wait, is that a dirty word in there somewhere? No, okay, that's fine. Perseus. I think it is. I think it's that. But anyway, if you Google search Perseus and Tufts, you'll be able to get there. But yeah, that's a fantastic website. Again, I went to school for classics. I got my master's in it, so I'm very familiar with a lot of ancient sources for things. And there are, of course, there are names from ancient sources that are sort of too iconic, like for, in a lot of cases, Achilles. Hercules certainly is not a name that you would come across randomly. So you would need a good reason for having that in your system or in your game or in your write-in. Of course, if it's a direct reference, then that's fine as well. But there are names that are from some of these ancient sources that are much more accessible. The name Ajax, for example. Ajax was a Greek hero who literally fought alongside Achilles, but the name Ajax has continued to be used across time in a lot of different sources. It's in my book because there are superheroes or characters in comic books named Ajax. So that one might be less jarring to somebody who is coming across it randomly. But yeah, going through a lot of ancient things have their lists of characters, and yeah, you can find all sorts of cool names out there. And yeah, shortening names, yeah, exactly. And I talked about that a little bit before, but yeah, taking a long crazy name from a fantasy or a sci-fi or a superhero setting and just shortening it, yeah, give new life to other names. And Caligon the Black, it reminds me of, again, one of the funny ones that I have in my book is Blackagar Boltagon, who, if you're a Marvel fan, you might know as Black Bolt. And yes, Black Bolt is the short form of his full name, Blackagar Boltagon, which is like one of the top 5 most ridiculous names that I have come across, I think. Oh, that's cool. And Colin and Dante, both black male dragon youngsters. That's cool. Yeah, Dante is another name, of course, that has ancient usages and then a bunch of more modern usages, and including in geeky stuff. So yeah, we are, and yes, there is a bathroom cleaner named Ajax. Yeah, it's funny, when I was in grad school, I would have when we were talking about Greek mythology, and I'd say, okay, name me places and examples where you see ancient mythological names or like references to characters in modern day stuff. And yeah, Ajax, I think for some of the class I actually brought a can of Ajax and was like, and here's one. But yeah, but I don't think people think of that as the first thing they think of when they hear Ajax. They might now. I certainly don't. So we are coming up to 11 o'clock my time, whatever time it is around where you are. So again, feel free to leave. I know lots of people have other cool things that they are doing today. Thank you so much for being here. I'll stick around again a little bit longer if people have questions or anything else you would like to talk about. But yeah, thanks for hanging out. I love talking names. Like I said, I'm on all the social medias all the time if you ever want to get in touch or talk to me. Where will this be posted? You know what? I don't know. I have a YouTube channel, so I may put it there. So again, if you follow me on the social medias, I can put it there. But like I said, I am always available to talk about names, no matter who you are or where you are. So yeah, what cool Gen Con online things are happening the rest of today? I actually don't have anything else scheduled. So I don't know what the cool big events are today. I know there was a lot going on yesterday. And of course, there's Gen Con happening in person. I wish I could be there, not this year, but yeah. And thanks everybody for being here. I was at Gen Con 2 years ago, which was great, and then a number of years ago, I had gone 2 years in a row. Gen Con is super cool. If you haven't been to Gen Con in person and you get a chance to go next year or in the future, I highly recommend it. It is super, super cool. Ooh, dramatic interaction masterclass. That sounds cool. Oh, well, Rebecca, I'm glad you enjoyed this, and I hope you all had a great Gen Con online. I know we're living in very interesting times. I'm very thankful that conventions like Gen Con are doing this kind of thing, allowing us to have some of the meetups and the feelings and the talking and the interacting that a lot of us are missing. And it's a great opportunity for just to have some fun online and to give us a break from our daily life that can be somewhat less interesting. Again, I have two small children, so my life is very complicated and very, very busy. So I don't get to many, now there are more conventions opening up. I live in Southern California, so we have a lot of conventions around here, and they're starting up in earnest. And with two small children home, it's challenging deciding, do we go back to conventions? Do we wait a little bit longer? How safe are they? So yeah, but yeah, cool. Like I said, yeah, anybody who wants to chat, like I said, follow me, find me. I'm at Norse Meet on all the places. Yeah, etymology is great. Folklore, mythology, it's all great stuff. Signata, ooh, cool. Is that swan themed? So yeah. So again, yeah, anyone have any questions, let me know in chat, and we can talk there. Otherwise, have a great rest of your Gen Con online. And anything else you're doing today. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Oh, trademarked. Awesome. Yeah, anytime, for those of you who aren't familiar with, anytime you see anything with Cygnus, CYGN, or any various forms or endings based on that, that's from an ancient word for swan. Cygnus has appeared, my goodness, there are lots of those especially in sci-fi. It's escaping me. There's a very famous ship, the Cygnus. What was it? What was the Cygnus in? There's a constellation too. Yeah. Was that in the black hole? There's a ship called the Cygnus. Oh my God, this is gonna drive me crazy. I'm gonna have to look this up as soon as we're done here. Maybe I can find it really quick. What sci-fi property had? Okay, it was black hole. All right. Woof. Man, that would have distressed me if I couldn't figure that one out. Yeah, and that's another thing too. Looking at, it's a little tougher, but you can look at names of spaceships or sailing ships or things like that for name inspirations. Sometimes that there are certainly lots of cases where that won't be helpful, but there are some cool names that have been used for ships that you might be able to repurpose for other things. Oh, there was a Cygnus hospital in City of Heroes. That's great. Yeah, and it's so cool when you see, again, especially as someone like me and some of you who are familiar with ancient mythologies, or if you've studied this kind of stuff, to see these names reused in other places. It's like, oh, that's cool, or oh, I recognize that. Now, it can also be, in some cases, it can be spoilers. A really good example of that is the American Gods. I never read it, but I watched the first season, and you're not quite sure who the characters are and what deities or divinities they are. And then as soon as one of the main characters said, it's Wednesday, it's my day, I was like, oh, he's Odin. Okay. It was like, well, yeah, because I know way too much about ancient mythologies, and Odin is Wotan becomes Wednesday. So it's like that. Obviously that's in there for people who understand that reference, but sometimes you get you might get the reference a little bit too early for things. But again, that's the cool thing about using these traditional names or names with meaning built in. in your writing or in your games or in your artwork, because you can foreshadow stuff that some people might get, but a lot of people won't. Or again, like I said multiple times, flip that on its head. Use a name of a hero for a villain, and vice versa. So yeah, all of that good stuff. I'm trying to think of any names that I've used recently that have been interesting. I was on an on Hyper RPG for a couple of years, and I played a character whose name was Ricky. I chose that because it was an RPG that took place in the 80s, and I felt like Ricky was a really it felt like Rickies were everywhere in the 80s, so I figured that was a good throwback to the 1980s. I grew up in the 80s, so I have nostalgia for that era. Of course, so many good cartoons in the mid to late 80s, lots of great character names, and some that just keep coming back. Even Transformers has some names that you can kind of use for other things. Oh yeah, naming a Esme Cora, Sweet Maiden, and then yeah, flipping those expectations with names can be really fun for sure. Yeah, I think I have like 3 Transformers names in my book. I didn't do a lot of robots and like robot-y sounding things. That'll be in the next one maybe. But yeah, there are a couple of Transformers had names that were close enough. Definitely, there's a Transformer, but many more people would know this character name from Star Wars, the expanded universe. Dash is a good one, right? Dash Rendar. There's a Transformer named Dash. There are a couple of other Dashes out there, so I had to have an entry for Dash. But yeah, there are properties where names are not necessarily easy to pull from. Transformers is one. Digimon is another one. Obviously, you're probably not going to grab full Digimon names because everything ends in mon, but there's certainly the beginning parts that you can adapt and reuse for other things. Pokemon names are pretty specific, but again, not everybody out there knows all the million Pokemon names. So you could probably use some of the rarer ones, and people wouldn't know what the reference is. So yeah, overall, research is your number one thing. Also, give yourself an epithet or make a name with some apostrophes in it, because that's always great fun. Cool. So again, thanks everybody for hanging out. You can also, if you want to post a message, there's also the message section of this event on the GenCon online website. I should probably check that when I started, in case anybody had any issues. Hopefully there weren't any, because I didn't check the message section. Oops. Okay, nothing's on there. Good. Yeah. So I'm gonna head off now, but like I said, everybody have a great day. Have fun naming your characters, your kids, your pets, and anything like that. And yeah, hopefully, like I said, hopefully I'll see you online, or I'll see you at Gen Con next year. All right. Thanks everybody. Bye.